Hello, and welcome. Tonight, we have a quiet story for you from the world of motor racing. We will be telling the story of how the Ferrari team began. It is a story about a young man, his passion for automobiles, and a dream that would eventually create a legend. Our journey starts in the north of Italy, over 100 years ago. The world was a different place then, and the first motor cars were just beginning to appear on the roads. It is here that we will begin, on a cold winter's day, with a father who took his two young sons to see their very first motor race. The year was 1908, and the world was still a quiet place. In the small city of Modena, in the north of Italy, a man named Alfredo Ferrari owned a metalworking business. He built sheds and workshops for the local railways, and he was a man who understood the strength and the beauty of steel. Alfredo had two sons. The eldest was named after him, but everyone called him Dino. The youngest was a quiet, observant boy named Enzo. He was 10 years old. One cold morning, Alfredo decided to take his two sons on a trip. They were not going far, just to the nearby city of Bologna. But for young Enzo, it felt like a great adventure. They traveled the roads from Modena to Bologna, the winter air crisp and thin. When they arrived, the city was alive with a special kind of energy. A motor race was happening that day, an event called the Circuito di Bologna. Alfredo found a good spot for his family to watch along the side of the road. For Enzo, the wait was filled with a quiet sense of wonder. He watched the crowd and listened to the murmurs of anticipation. And then he heard it. It was a sound unlike any he had ever heard before. A low rumble that grew into a mechanical roar. The first racing car appeared, a machine of wire and steel, breathing smoke as it thundered past them. Then another came, and another. The cars were loud, and they were fast. But the young boy was not scared by the noise or the speed. He was captivated. He watched the drivers, their faces determined, their hands gripping the large steering wheels as they fought to control their powerful machines. He saw a famous driver named Vincenzo launch a flyby, and he felt a connection to the moment that he could not explain. He didn't cheer or shout like the others around him. He simply stood there, watching, his eyes following each car until it disappeared from sight. The father, Alfredo, had brought his sons to see a spectacle, a day of excitement. But for his youngest son, Enzo, it was something more. That evening, as they traveled back home to Modena in the fading light, Enzo was still quiet. But inside him, something new had been planted. A tiny seed of an idea, a feeling he did not yet have the words for. And for the quiet 10-year-old boy, nothing would ever be the same. The experience of the race did not fade. Back in Modena, in the quiet routine of his life, the memory of those powerful machines stayed with Enzo. He was the son of a man who worked with his hands, and for the first time, Enzo began to see the world through his father's eyes. Alfredo's workshop was a place of purpose and creation. The air inside was thick with the scent of hot metal and coal smoke. It was a world of steady, rhythmic sounds, the sharp ring of a hammer on an anvil, the low hiss of the forge, the grinding of the lathe. Before the race, it was just his father's business. But now, Enzo saw it differently. He would spend hours in the workshop, not playing, but watching. He watched as his father and his men took raw, heavy pieces of steel and transformed them. They would heat the metal until it glowed a brilliant, soft orange, then bend it, shape it, and give it a new form. He learned that a machine was not just a collection of parts. It was something that had to be built with care and with understanding. He saw the pride his father took in a clean weld or a perfectly drilled hole. He learned that strength and reliability were not accidents. They were the results of patience and skill. While his older brother Dino was more outgoing, Enzo remained the quiet observer. He listened to the men talk about mechanics, about engines, and about the new automobiles that were slowly beginning to appear. His mind would often drift back to the Circuito di Bologna. He would imagine the engines of those racing cars, and he would picture them being built with the same care and precision he saw in his father's workshop every day. The boy who had been captivated by the speed of the race was now becoming fascinated by the substance of the machine. He was learning the language of metal, the fundamental grammar of engineering, without even realizing it. The blacksmith's son was quietly laying the foundation for a dream he could not yet name. The world of the workshop and the simple life in Medina was not destined to last. The Great War swept across Europe, and it changed everything. A wave of illness that followed the war took his father, Alfredo. A short time later, the war itself took his brother, Dino. Suddenly, Enzo was no longer a boy watching from the sidelines. The family's metalworking business closed, and the future he might have had was gone. He was left with his mother, a small inheritance, and a formal letter of recommendation from his father's old army colonel. He knew he could not stay in Medina. The memories were too heavy, and the opportunities were too few. His mind was set on one place, the city of Turin. Turin was the heart of the Italian car industry. It was the home of Fiat, the largest and most powerful car manufacturer in the country. He believed that if he could work there, he could begin to build a new life. And so he packed his few belongings and made the journey. When he arrived, the great Fiat factory was even more imposing than he had imagined. Its gates were like the entrance to a fortress, and he felt a nervous hope as he walked inside to present his letter. The meeting was brief. A man in a suit looked at his papers, listened to his story, and then gave him the news. The company was downsizing after the war. There were too many workers already. The words were polite, but they were final. They were not hiring. Enzo walked back out into the cold Turin air. The hope that had carried him all the way from Medina was gone, replaced by a deep and hollow feeling of disappointment. The city felt huge and indifferent. Its grand buildings seemed to look down on him. He had nowhere to go and nothing to do. He found a bench in a nearby park, and he sat there as a gentle snow began to fall, dusting the ground in a thin layer of white. He was 20 years old, alone in a strange city, with no job and no clear path forward. The dream of working with cars, a dream that had once seemed so bright and clear, now felt like a closed door. And for a long while, he just sat there, watching the snow fall, feeling the quiet weight of being utterly on his own. The snow in Turin eventually stopped falling, and the feeling of despair could not last forever. A person cannot sit on a park bench forever. Enzo knew he had to find work, any work, to survive. He looked away from the grand gates of Fiat and began to explore the smaller, less-known workshops of the city. He eventually found a small company called CMN. They were not famous, and their business was simple. They converted old trucks and vehicles left over from the war into chassis for new passenger cars. They gave him a job. It was not a glorious job. He was a test driver, but his task was simply to deliver the bare chassis from the CMN workshop to a coach builder in Milan, who would then build the body of the car. And so his work began. He would sit on a simple wooden crate, exposed to the wind and the rain, and drive these raw, skeletal machines across the country. There was no comfortable seat, no roof over his head, just an engine, a frame, and 4 wheels. But for Enzo, it was everything. He was driving. He was learning. He could feel the engine's vibrations through the frame. He could feel how the machine handled on the open road, how it responded to his touch. He was once again connected to the world of automobiles. He did his job well, with a quiet competence that people began to notice. The small CMN company decided that a good way to get attention would be to enter the world of motor racing. And they needed drivers. They saw the passion in their young test driver, and they offered him a chance. Soon, Enzo found himself in Sicily, preparing for one of the most famous and difficult races in the world, the Targa Florio. It was not a race on a smooth, closed circuit. It was a brutal endurance test on rough, winding public roads that circled the mountains. On the day of the race, Enzo was no longer just a delivery driver. He was a racing driver. For hours, he drove his CMN car over the dusty, sun-baked roads. He navigated treacherous corners and long, punishing stretches of track. He finished the race, He did not win, but that did not matter. He had felt the challenge of competition. He had pushed a machine to its limits. The boy who had watched from the side of the road in Bologna was now a part of the spectacle himself. The closed doors of Turin had led him down a different path, a path that led not to a factory floor, but to the starting line of a race. His performance at the Targa Florio did not go unnoticed. In the small, close-knit world of Italian motor racing, reputation was everything. Enzo had shown not just courage, but a deep, intuitive understanding of his machine. He knew how to push it to its limits without breaking it, a skill that was rare and highly valued. He continued to race for CMN, his name appearing in more events. At a hill climb race near Parma, he found himself competing against the most formidable team in the country, Alfa Romeo. Their cars were sleek, powerful, and impeccably prepared. Their drivers were the heroes of the sport. Enzo drove with his usual quiet determination. He did not win the race, but he put up a remarkable fight, his small car keeping pace with machines that were far superior. After the race, as the cars cooled and the crowds began to fade, a man approached him. He introduced himself as a senior figure from Alfa Romeo. He had been watching Enzo. He spoke of the young driver's skill, but more than that, he spoke of his spirit. He saw a seriousness, a focus that went beyond the simple desire to win. He saw a man who loved the automobile itself. The conversation was brief, but it ended with an invitation. An offer to leave the small CMN team and come to Milan to become an official driver for Alfa Romeo. For Enzo, it was the moment his life changed. This was not Fiat, the impersonal giant that had turned him away. This was Alfa Romeo, the pinnacle of racing. This was a team built on passion. When Enzo first walked into the Alfa Romeo headquarters at Portello, in Milan, he felt a sense of coming home. The workshops were vast and filled with a low, purposeful hum of activity. Mechanics in clean overalls moved with a quiet confidence, their hands working on engines that were treated like works of art. The air smelled of clean oil and polished metal. This was a world away from the gritty workshops he had known. It was a place where motor racing was not just a hobby or a marketing exercise. It was a science and an art form. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was a part of it. He was introduced to the other drivers, men like Antonio Ascari and Giuseppe Campari, whose names were known all across Europe. They were not just teammates, they were mentors. He listened as they spoke about racing, about car setup, and about the fine art of finding the perfect racing line. It was here that he was formally introduced to the team's symbol of good fortune, the quadrifoglio, a simple four-leaf clover painted inside a white triangle. He learned the story of its origin, how a driver named Ugo Savacci had painted it on his car for luck just before winning the Targa Florio years earlier. After Savacci's tragic death in a car that did not bear the clover, it became the official, revered emblem of the entire racing team. To drive for Alfa Romeo was to be protected by that clover. It was a symbol of shared history, of triumphs, and of losses. To be a part of the quadrifoglio was to be part of a family. The man who had once sat alone on a park bench in Turin, lost and without a future, was now embraced by the most respected racing team in Italy. He had found his place. And here, in the embrace of the four-leaf clover, his own dream would begin to take on a new and much grander shape. Driving for Alfa Romeo was, for a time, the fulfillment of Enzo's greatest ambition. He was a respected driver on the most prestigious team in Italy. He had a salary, a title, and the thrill of competition. He won races, including his first major victory at the Circuito del Savio, and his reputation grew with each passing year. Yet, a quiet restlessness began to stir within him. He found that the thrill of driving was slowly being replaced by a deeper fascination with what happened before the race. He would spend more and more of his time in the workshops, talking with the engineers and mechanics. He was more interested in why a particular engine was running well than in the trophy he might win with it. He would observe the logistics, the planning, the immense effort it took to bring a team of cars to the starting line. He also saw the limitations of being part of a large corporation. Alfa Romeo's commitment to racing could change with the winds of the economy. Some years, the company would pour immense resources into the team. In other years, facing financial pressure, they would scale back their involvement or pull out of racing altogether, leaving their talented drivers and engineers in a state of uncertainty. This inconsistency was something Enzo could not accept. For him, racing was not a department. It was the entire purpose. During this time, he was not just a driver. He was also a gifted salesman and ambassador for the Alfa Romeo brand. He began to form powerful relationships with wealthy clients and amateur drivers who bought Alfa Romeo cars. Two of these men were the Caniato brothers, Augusto and Alfredo, who were wealthy textile merchants with a passion for motorsport. One evening, over a long dinner, Enzo laid out an idea that had been forming in his mind. The conversation was not about a single race, but about the future of racing itself. He spoke of the need for stability, for a dedicated organization that lived and breathed motorsport, independent of the shifting priorities of a corporate boardroom. He proposed the creation of a new entity. It would not be a car manufacturer. Instead, it would be an organization that would manage and race cars on behalf of wealthy gentlemen drivers. More importantly, it would function as the official, outsourced racing department for Alfa Romeo. It would provide a permanent, professional home for the best drivers, mechanics, and engineers, ensuring that their collective talent would never be scattered by a corporate decision. The Caniato brothers were captivated by the vision. They saw the logic and the passion in Enzo's plan. They, along with a few other wealthy sponsors, agreed to provide the financial backing. And so, in late 1929, a new company was officially formed. Enzo chose a name that was both humble and deeply symbolic. He called it Scuderia Ferrari. In Italian, Scuderia means a stable for horses. It was a name that evoked the thoroughbred racehorses of old, a place where fine animals were cared for, trained, and prepared for competition. Enzo saw no difference. His Scuderia would be a stable for the finest racing machines and, more importantly, a stable for the finest men. He established his headquarters not in Milan, but back in his hometown of Modena. He returned to the city he had left as a young man with nothing, now as the founder and director of his own enterprise. He set up his workshop, a place that was now his to command. His role had fundamentally changed. He still raced occasionally, but his days as a full-time driver were coming to an end. He was now the Direttore Sportivo, the sporting director. He was the organizer, the talent scout, the strategist. He had created a home, a sanctuary for the passion of racing, all under his own name. The Scuderia Ferrari was born. The Scuderia Ferrari was real. It had a name, a workshop in Modena, and a purpose. It was a stable of the finest cars and the most dedicated men. But it was missing one crucial thing, a symbol, an emblem to fly like a banner, to represent everything they were and everything they hoped to be. An army has its standard, a kingdom has its crest. A racing team, Enzo believed, needed a soul that could be seen. The answer did not come from a designer or a committee. It came from a moment of victory and a quiet, respectful meeting that followed. It happened in 1932. Enzo, in his role as director, had prepared his team for a race at the Circuito del Savio in Ravenna. It was the same race where he himself had earned his first major victory as a driver years earlier. This time, he watched from the pits as his Alfa Romeo cars, managed and prepared by his Scuderia, dominated the field. It was a flawless performance, a testament to his vision of a professional, dedicated racing organization. The victory was celebrated, but for Enzo, something more significant was about to happen. After the race, he was approached and formally introduced to Count Enrico and Countess Paolina Baracca. They were a noble family, and they were the parents of a national hero. Their son, Francesco Baracca, had been Italy's greatest fighter pilot during the Great War. He was an ace, a figure of immense bravery and skill who had been lost in the final days of the conflict. The Baracca family had watched the race that day, and they had been deeply impressed not just by the speed of Enzo's team, but by the spirit of courage and dedication they showed. They extended a formal invitation for Enzo to visit them at their home. He accepted, and a few days later, he found himself in the quiet, elegant drawing room of the Baracca family villa. The atmosphere was a world away from the noise and oil of the workshop. It was a place of refined silence, filled with old portraits, polished wood, and the polite clink of teacups. They spoke for a while about the race, but soon the conversation turned to their son. With a gentle, somber pride, they spoke of Francesco. They described his love of flight, his daring in the sky, and the symbol he had chosen to paint on the side of his airplane. It was a black horse, rearing up on its hind legs, the Cavallino Rampanti, the Prancing Horse. It had been the emblem of his family's cavalry regiment, a symbol of courage and heritage that he carried with him into battle. As the afternoon light softened, the Countess Paulina looked at Enzo directly. She saw in this determined young man the same fire and passionate spirit that had defined her son. She then made a simple, extraordinary proposal. "Ferrari," she said, her voice soft but clear, "put my son's prancing horse on your cars. It will bring you good luck." It was not a request, and it was not a business proposition. It was a gift. It was the passing of a legacy from a mother, a transfer of a hero's spirit from the sky to the road. Enzo was deeply moved by the honor. He understood the immense weight of the gesture. This was not just a picture of a horse. It was the memory of a beloved son, a national icon. He accepted with quiet gratitude. When he returned to Medina, he took the emblem and, with a single, brilliant touch, he made it his own. He kept the black prancing horse exactly as it was, a mark of respect for Francesco Baracca, but he placed it against a vibrant, canary yellow background. Yellow was the official color of his beloved hometown, the city of Medina. With that, the emblem was complete. The black horse represented the courage and heritage of a hero. The yellow shield represented the roots and the home of the man who would carry that legacy forward. The Scuderia Ferrari finally had its symbol. It was a gift from a mother's memory, now ready to become a legend in its own right. The 1930s became the golden age of the Scuderia Ferrari. Under Enzo's meticulous and demanding leadership, the team became the most dominant force in motor racing. The combination was perfect. The engineering brilliance of Alfa Romeo's cars, managed, prepared, and raced with the unwavering focus of Enzo's organization. The prancing horse on its yellow shield became a symbol of inevitable victory. Drivers like Tazio Nuvolari, the Flying Montuan, became legends at the wheel of Enzo's Alfas. The Scuderia's bright red cars were unbeatable on the great circuits of Europe, from Monza to the Nürburgring. For anyone looking from the outside, it seemed that Enzo had achieved everything he had ever wanted. He was not just a participant in the world of racing. He was its unofficial king. But success did not bring him peace. In fact, it sharpened a feeling of frustration that had been growing within him for years. The relationship with Alfa Romeo, once a perfect partnership, was beginning to feel like a gilded cage. Enzo was not merely a manager. He was a man with his own ideas. He would spend long nights in the Medina workshop, talking with his engineers, sketching out improvements for the cars. He saw ways to make the engines more powerful, the chassis more balanced, the aerodynamics more efficient. He would pass these detailed suggestions on to the engineers in Milan, but more often than not, his ideas were met with polite resistance or simply ignored. The engineers at Alfa Romeo were brilliant, but they were part of a large, conservative corporation. They had their own methods, their own hierarchies, and their own pace of development. They saw Enzo as a gifted team manager, a race strategist, but not as an engineer. He was a client, not a creator. This dynamic became a source of constant, grating friction. He would travel to Milan for meetings, his briefcase full of drawings and technical notes, and he would leave feeling unheard. He would watch his rivals, particularly the German teams of Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union, develop radical new technologies with massive government funding, and he felt a desperate urge to respond, to innovate, to fight back on his own terms. But he was bound by the decisions made in the boardrooms of Milan. He was racing their cars, their engines, their technology. His heart was no longer just in the management of the race, but in the creation of the machine itself. The boy who had watched his father forge steel was now a man who longed to forge his own engines. He dreamed of a car where every single component, from the smallest bolt in the engine to the final shape of the bodywork, was a direct result of his own philosophy. He began to feel like a conductor leading a magnificent orchestra, but forbidden from writing the music. The applause of the crowd and the shine of the trophies felt hollow when he knew, deep down, that the instrument he was playing was not his own. The more the Scuderia won, the more Enzo felt the constraints of his role. His official title was sporting director, but he felt like a caretaker. His ambition had grown beyond managing another company's cars. He no longer wanted to simply prepare the horse for battle. He wanted to build the horse from scratch. The restless heart of the leader was no longer satisfied with victory alone. It now craved the ultimate freedom, the freedom to create. The quiet frustration between Enzo Ferrari and the management of Alfa Romeo could not last. The tension, which had been building for years beneath a surface of shared success, finally came to a breaking point in 1939. Alfa Romeo, seeing the immense prestige and marketing power that the Scuderia had built, made a corporate decision. They decided to reabsorb their racing division entirely, bringing it back in-house. They would no longer outsource their racing efforts to an independent entity in Modena. They would create a new department called Alfa Corse, and it would be based in their headquarters in Milan. They offered Enzo a position. He was invited to come to Milan and lead this new department. On paper, it was a promotion. He would be the manager of the entire racing program, an official employee of the great Alfa Romeo. But for Enzo, the offer was an insult. It meant abandoning his home, his city of Modena. It meant closing the doors of the Scuderia Ferrari, the stable he had built from nothing. It meant giving up his autonomy and becoming just another department head in a vast corporate structure, subject to the very boardrooms and committees that had frustrated him for years. He would be a well-paid employee, but he would no longer be his own man. The meetings in Milan were tense and formal. The Alfa Romeo executives could not understand his hesitation. They had won everything together. Why would he not want to continue this success as a formal part of their organization? They saw it as a simple business decision. Enzo saw it as a matter of soul. He tried to negotiate, to find a way to preserve the Scuderia's independence, but the corporation's mind was made up. The choice was clear: join them on their terms or walk away. And so, with a heavy heart, he made his decision. He refused their offer. He chose to leave. The separation was not amicable. It was a divorce, and the terms were harsh. As part of the severance agreement he was forced to sign, Alfa Romeo included a particularly cruel clause. He was a formidable competitor, and they knew it. The agreement legally forbade him from using his own name, the name Ferrari, in connection with any racing activities or on any car he might build. This restriction was to last for 4 years. He walked away from the company that had defined his adult life, stripped of his ability to compete, and, most painfully, stripped of the right to use his own name. He returned to Modena not as a conquering hero, but as an outcast. The Scuderia Ferrari was officially dissolved. The Prancing Horse emblem was put away. An enforced silence fell over his racing ambitions. The world was on the brink of another great war, and the golden age of motorsport was coming to an abrupt end. For Enzo, the timing felt like a bitter footnote to his own personal defeat. He was 41 years old, legally silenced, and his future, once so clear and dominant, was now a complete and unnerving unknown. For 4 years, The name Ferrari would have to disappear from the world of racing. The agreement with Alfa Romeo was a cage. He could not use the name Ferrari, and he could not participate in major races. But Enzo was not a man who knew how to be idle, and his mind did not understand the meaning of silence. The cage had bars, but it was not completely sealed. He began to search for the gaps, the spaces where he could still work, still create. He returned to his workshop in Modena, the same building that had once been the proud headquarters of the Scuderia Ferrari. The bright red Alfa Romeo race cars were gone, and the space felt cavernously empty. The Prancing Horse emblems were no longer on the walls. It was just a building filled with tools, machines, and a quiet, determined group of men who had chosen to stay with him rather than move to Milan. He needed a new name for his new, smaller company. It had to be something that complied with the legal agreement, something anonymous. He called it Auto Avio Costruzione, which simply meant auto aviation construction. It was a deliberately bland and technical name, a shield to hide the fiery ambition that still burned within him. Officially, the company manufactured machine tools and aircraft parts. The looming war meant there was a growing demand for precision-milled metal components, and this work provided a steady stream of income. It kept the lights on and kept his loyal mechanics employed. He was once again, in a way, following in his father's footsteps as a master of metalworking. But behind the official business, a secret project was taking shape. A group of wealthy clients, friends of Enzo, approached him. They were planning to enter a race in Brescia, the legendary Mille Miglia. They wanted him to build them a car. It would be a sports car, not a Grand Prix machine, and therefore it would not technically violate the spirit of his agreement with Alfa Romeo, which was focused on top-tier racing. Enzo agreed. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. This was his chance to finally build a complete car, from the ground up, based entirely on his own ideas. Working in a small, partitioned-off section of the workshop, he and his team began their work. The project was referred to simply as the 815, a name derived from its technical specifications, an 8-cylinder, 1.5-liter engine. The engine itself was a masterpiece of ingenuity. Since he did not have the resources to design and build a completely new engine block, he cleverly took two small Fiat engines and combined them, casting a new, custom cylinder head to create a single, lightweight straight-eight. The bodywork was designed by the famous Carrozzeria Touring, but to Enzo's precise specifications. It was a beautiful, streamlined spider with flowing, aerodynamic lines. Every component was chosen for lightness and efficiency. In early 1940, two of these cars were completed. They were beautiful, innovative, and quick. But as they were rolled out of the workshop, they bore no maker's name on their bodywork. There was no Prancing Horse, no Ferrari badge. They were orphans, the brilliant but anonymous children of a silenced creator. They were the cars without a name, the first quiet testament to what Enzo Ferrari could do when he was finally, completely, on his own. The two beautiful Auto Avio Costruzione 815s raced at the Mille Miglia in 1940. They were astonishingly fast, leading their class with ease. It was a moment of quiet vindication for Enzo. He had built a complete car, and it was a success. However, the victory was not to be. Both cars were forced to retire with mechanical failures before the finish. They were brilliant, but they were new and untested, and their fragility showed. Before Enzo could learn from these lessons and refine his designs, history intervened. The world plunged fully into the Second World War. Italy became a war zone. Motorsport, along with all other luxuries of peacetime, ceased to exist. The Mille Miglia was not run again for years. Enzo's small factory, like all industrial sites, became a potential target. He had no choice but to convert his entire operation to support the war effort. The delicate work of building racing engines was replaced by the grim, repetitive task of manufacturing heavy-duty, grinding machines used to produce ball bearings. The beautiful, flowing lines of car bodies were replaced by the hard, angular shapes of military hardware. In 1943, the danger grew too great. Medina was being targeted by Allied bombing raids. To protect his factory and his workers, Enzo made the difficult decision to move his entire operation. He relocated his machinery and his men a few miles south, to a small, quiet agricultural town that he knew well. The town was called Maranello. There, in a collection of modest new buildings surrounded by farmland, he continued his work. He was no longer a racing director or a car designer. He was a wartime industrialist, a provider of tools, a man doing his best to survive and to keep his company afloat in a world that had no time for his dreams. His factory was bombed twice. Each time, he and his workers would patiently sift through the rubble, salvaging what machinery they could, and they would rebuild. During these long, dark years, the dream of the Prancing Horse seemed more distant than ever. But it did not die. In the evenings, after the noise of the grinding machines had fallen silent, Enzo would retreat to a small, quiet room that served as his office. By the dim light of a single lamp, safe from the blackout that shrouded the town, he would unroll fresh sheets of paper. While his factory produced the tools of war by day, his mind produced the blueprints of peace by night. He was no longer bound by the 4-year silence. That agreement had expired in 1943, a quiet, unnoticed date in the midst of global chaos. He was now free. He began to design a new car. Not a sports car built from other people's parts, but a true Grand Prix machine. And at its heart, a new engine. He was obsessed with the idea of a V12. To him, the 12-cylinder engine was the pinnacle of mechanical engineering. It was complex, it was powerful, but it could also be incredibly smooth. It was an engine, he felt, that had nobility. Night after night, surrounded by the distant sounds of a world at war, Enzo Ferrari filled the pages with his vision. He drew crankshafts and pistons, designed cylinder heads and valve trains. He was not just designing an engine. He was pouring all of his frustration, all of his ambition, and all of his hope into a set of technical drawings. He was building his future on paper, waiting for the day the bombs would stop, so he could once again begin to build it in steel. The war finally ended. A deep, collective breath of relief swept across Europe. The silence that fell over the continent was not the silence of fear, but of peace. In Maranello, the grinding machines that had produced the tools of war fell quiet for the last time. The factory, twice bombed and twice rebuilt, stood ready for a new purpose. For Enzo Ferrari, the moment he had spent years preparing for had finally arrived. The blueprints he had drawn by lamplight during the darkest nights of the war were no longer just paper dreams. They were now the sacred texts for a new beginning. He gathered his small, loyal team of mechanics and engineers, men who had stayed with him through everything. Among them was a brilliant designer named Gioacchino Colombo, an engineer who had worked at Alfa Romeo and who shared Enzo's passion for engine design. Enzo laid the drawings out on the long workbenches. He spoke to his men not with loud proclamations, but with the quiet, intense focus of a master craftsman. He explained his vision. They were not going to build just any engine. They were going to build a V12. In post-war Italy, a country struggling to rebuild from ruins, this was a radical, almost defiant idea. Resources were incredibly scarce. Other manufacturers were focused on building tiny, practical, fuel-efficient cars for the masses. To choose to build a complex, thirsty, and expensive 12-cylinder engine was an act of audacious faith. It was a declaration that beauty, performance, and ambition still mattered. The work began. The Maranello workshop, once a place of grim wartime production, was transformed into a laboratory of creation. The sounds of hammers and lathes returned, but this time they were working not on instruments of destruction, but on the components of a mechanical masterpiece. Enzo was everywhere. He was not a distant boss in an office. He was on the workshop floor from dawn until dusk. He would run his fingers over a newly milled engine block, checking the smoothness of the metal. He would listen to the sound of a valve seating, his ear tuned to the tiniest imperfection. He obsessed over every detail, from the weight of the pistons to the precise angle of the cylinder banks. Colombo and the engineering team worked tirelessly to turn the drawings into reality. Slowly, piece by precious piece, the engine began to take shape on the assembly stand. It was a sculpture of aluminum and steel, a complex web of wiring, tubing, and precisely machined gears. To Enzo, it was more beautiful than any work of art. Finally, the day came to start it for the first time. The small engine was mounted on a test bench in a corner of the workshop. The fuel lines were connected, the ignition was wired. A small group of mechanics gathered around, their faces a mixture of hope and nervous tension. Enzo gave a quiet nod. A mechanic pressed the starter. The engine turned, coughed, and then erupted into life. But it was not a rough, clattering noise. It was a sound that none of them had ever heard before. It was a crisp, high-pitched, and mechanically complex sound. It was the sound of 12 small cylinders firing in perfect, rapid succession. It was not a roar, it was a symphony. The men in the workshop did not cheer. They simply stood in silence, listening. In that moment, they all understood. They were not just building an engine. They were giving a voice to Enzo Ferrari's dream. And that voice was unlike anything the world had ever heard. The engine had a voice. Now, it needed a body. While the V12 was being perfected, Enzo and his team began work on the rest of the car. The project was given its official name, a name that Enzo could finally, proudly use. It was to be the Ferrari 125S. The number 125 represented the displacement of a single cylinder in cubic centimeters. The S stood for sport. The design of the chassis was simple but strong, a traditional ladder frame made of steel tubing. Enzo's focus was not on radical chassis innovation. For him, the car was, and always would be, a life support system for the engine. Everything was designed to serve the V12. The suspension, the brakes, the gearbox. Each component was chosen or fabricated with one purpose in mind: to faithfully transmit the engine's power to the road. As the bare, rolling chassis took shape, it was time to give it a skin. Enzo did not have a dedicated bodywork department in his small factory. Instead, he collaborated with independent artisans and coach builders, a common practice at the time. He wanted a shape that was functional, lightweight, and beautiful, but in a way that was purposeful, not decorative. The first body for the 125S was a simple, open-topped spider with flowing, cycle fender wings that left the wheels exposed. It was a shape born from the wind, with a long bonnet to house the magnificent engine and a compact cockpit for the driver. It was shaped by hand, with skilled panel beaters hammering thin sheets of aluminum over wooden bucks, their rhythmic tapping a constant, gentle percussion in the workshop. Then came the question of color. This was a decision Enzo did not take lightly. In the world of motor racing, there was an established tradition of national racing colors. French cars were blue, British cars were green, German cars were silver, and Italian cars, by tradition, were red. Rosso Corsa, the color of Italian racing. For Enzo, choosing this color was not just about following tradition. It was about claiming his place within it. He was building an Italian car, and it would wear the national color with pride. He wanted a shade of red that was deep, vibrant, and alive. A color that would be impossible to ignore. When the final coat of paint was applied, the transformation was complete. Standing in the quiet of the Maranello workshop, the car seemed to radiate its own energy. The brilliant red paint gleamed under the workshop lights, a stark and beautiful contrast to the gray, utilitarian world of post-war Italy. The Prancing Horse emblem, which had been put away for so many years, was finally brought out. A mechanic carefully affixed the yellow shield to the side of the car's long bonnet. The black horse, a symbol of a hero's courage, was now united with the yellow of Medina, on a body of Italian racing red, powered by the V12 engine that had been born from a dream in the dark. The car was no longer a collection of parts or a set of blueprints. It was a living, breathing entity. It was the physical manifestation of one man's relentless, unyielding ambition. After years of silence, years of war, and years of struggle, the first true Ferrari was finished, and it was ready. The 11th of May, 1947. The date was marked on the calendar in the Maranello workshop, a day that felt more like a final exam than a celebration. The new Ferrari 125S was ready for its first race. The chosen venue was a local circuit in the nearby city of Piacenza. It was a modest event, a race on public roads temporarily closed for the competition. It was not a grand international stage, but for Enzo, it was the most important race in the world. This would be the first time his name, his engine, and his car would face the judgment of the stopwatch. The car was entrusted to a driver named Franco Cortese, a veteran racer with steady hands and a calm demeanor. In the days leading up to the race, the atmosphere in the workshop was thick with a quiet, nervous energy. Every nut and bolt on the little red car was checked and rechecked. Enzo himself oversaw every detail, his face a mask of intense concentration. He spoke little, observing everything, his presence felt in every corner of the garage. On the morning of the race, the 125S was rolled onto the starting grid. Among the other cars, it looked small, delicate, and almost jewel-like. Its V12 engine, when started, produced a sound that was utterly distinct from the deeper, throatier roars of its larger-engined rivals. It was a high-pitched, intricate scream that made everyone on the grid turn and look. When the flag dropped, the little red car surged forward. Cortese drove with a masterful skill, and it quickly became apparent that the 125S was something special. It was astonishingly quick. The V12 engine, though small, revved with an eagerness that other cars simply couldn't match. It flew down the short straights and pulled away from the corners with an agility that left the crowd speechless. For lap after lap, the 125S was in the lead. It was a flawless, dominant performance. In the makeshift pit area, Enzo watched, his hands clasped behind his back, his face betraying no emotion. But inside, a feeling of immense validation was building. Everything he had ever believed about engineering, every decision he had made, was being proven right on this small Italian circuit. The world was witnessing the birth of a legend. The car was just 3 laps from the finish line, holding a commanding lead when it happened. Suddenly, the crisp, symphonic note of the V12 engine faltered. The car sputtered, coasted for a few hundred feet, and then rolled to a silent stop on the side of the road. A simple, frustrating failure. The fuel pump had broken. A hush fell over the crowd. The race was over for the little red car. Franco Cortese could do nothing but climb out and watch as the other cars he had so easily left behind, drove past to take the checkered flag. Back in the pits, the mechanics were devastated. They had come so close. But when they looked at Enzo, they did not see anger or disappointment. Instead, they saw something that looked almost like a quiet satisfaction. He walked over to the journalists who had gathered, expecting a statement of frustration. Instead, Enzo looked at them calmly and described the event. He did not speak of the broken part or the lost victory. He simply called it a glorious failure. His men were confused, but Enzo understood. The failure of a small, replaceable part was insignificant. What mattered was the promise. For the entire race, his car had been the class of the field. It had been faster, better, more advanced than anyone could have imagined. The failure was a minor setback, a simple lesson to be learned. The glory was in the proof. He knew, in that moment, that his car was not just a contender. It was a revolution, and this was only the beginning. The taste of that glorious failure did not linger. For Enzo and his team, it was simply a problem to be solved. They returned to the workshop in Maranello not with a sense of defeat, but with a renewed and urgent sense of purpose. The faulty fuel pump was analyzed, redesigned, and replaced with a stronger, more reliable component. The entire car was meticulously inspected, every lesson learned at Piacenza applied with immediate effect. There was no time to dwell on what could have been. There was only time to prepare for what was next. And what was next was just 2 weeks away. The date was May 25th, 1947. The location was Rome, for the Grand Prix of Rome. The circuit was a challenging one, laid out around the ancient baths of Caracalla, a place of history, power, and enduring legend. It felt like a fitting stage. Once again, Franco Cortese was behind the wheel of the 125S. The little red car, now bearing the lessons of its first outing, was rolled to the starting line. The memory of its dominant performance and its sudden failure was fresh in everyone's mind. There were whispers of anticipation and questions in the air. Was the car truly as fast as it had seemed? Or was it just a fragile flash of brilliance? The race began. From the very first lap, it was clear that the answer was a resounding yes. The 125S was not just fast, it was untouchable. The V12 engine sang its piercing, beautiful song through the ancient streets of Rome. Cortese drove with the confidence of a man who knew, with absolute certainty, the power and reliability beneath him. He took the lead and never looked back. This time, there were no hesitations. There were no mechanical faults. The car ran with the perfection of a fine watch. It completed lap after lap, its vibrant red color a blur against the timeless stone of the Roman ruins. When Franco Cortese crossed the finish line to take the checkered flag, there was no ambiguity. It was not a partial success or a promising debut. It was a victory, complete, total, and undeniable. He had won the Grand Prix of Rome, the first race ever won by a car bearing the name Ferrari. Back in Maranello, when the news arrived, a quiet but profound sense of joy filled the workshop. This was the moment. This was the culmination of everything. It was the vindication for the boy who had stood mesmerized at Bologna. It was the answer to the closed doors of Fiat. It was the triumph over the 4-year silence. It was the reward for the long nights spent drawing blueprints while bombs fell from the sky. Enzo Ferrari did not throw a grand party. He did not make a triumphant speech. His celebration was, as always, a quiet and intensely personal one. He had proven to Alfa Romeo, to his rivals, and most importantly, to himself, that his vision was correct. The journey was far from over. In fact, it had just truly begun. There would be countless other races, other victories, and other heartbreaks. But on that spring day in Rome, the first chapter was written in the history books. The quiet whisper of an idea, first heard by a young boy so long ago, had finally, undeniably, become a roar. And so, the first victory was won. And so, the first victory was won. The first of many to come. The first time the world truly heard the sound that had lived for so long in one man's mind. But that is a story for another night. For tonight, our journey is complete. The story has been told, and the workshop in Maranello can finally fall silent. You can let the details of the story begin to fade now. Like distant echoes, you can let them drift away. There is nothing left to follow, nothing left to figure out. All that is left is the feeling of peace. The path has been laid. The dream has been realized. And now, the time has come for your own journey into rest. Feel your body growing heavier, sinking comfortably into the surface beneath you. Feel the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, in and out. Each breath carries you a little further away from the waking world, a little deeper into comfort, a little closer to sleep. The prancing horse has found its stride, and you can now find your rest. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go. Just this moment, this quiet, this peace. Sleep now, the first of many to come. The first time the world truly heard the sound that had lived for so long in one man's mind. But that is a story for another night. For tonight, our journey is complete. The story has been told, and the workshop in Maranello can finally fall silent. You can let the details of the story begin to fade now. Like distant echoes, you can let them drift away. There is nothing left to follow, nothing left to figure out. All that is left is the feeling of peace. The path has been laid. The dream has been realized. And now, the time has come for your own journey into rest. Feel your body growing heavier, sinking comfortably into the surface beneath you. Feel the gentle rhythm of your own breathing, in and out. Each breath carries you a little further away from the waking world, a little deeper into comfort, a little closer to sleep. The prancing horse has found its stride, and you can now find your rest. There is nothing left to do, nowhere left to go. Just this moment, this quiet, this peace. Sleep now. The years following the victory in Rome were a period of steady, relentless work. The Ferrari name, once a whisper, was now spoken with respect in racing circles all across Europe. The little red cars from Maranello, with their unique 12-cylinder engines, were becoming a formidable presence. They won more races, and with each victory, the legend grew. The world itself was beginning to heal. The shadows of the war were receding, and a new sense of optimism was taking hold. People were looking for heroes again, for grand spectacles, for things that could capture the imagination. And so, the governing bodies of motorsport decided that the time was right for a new, ambitious beginning. For the year 1950, they announced the creation of the first official Formula One World Championship of Drivers. This was a monumental idea. It was no longer to be just a series of separate, important races, each with its own winner and its own glory. For the first time, these major Grand Prix events would be linked together. A driver's performance in Britain would count towards the same title as their performance in Italy or in Switzerland. At the end of the season, one man, and by extension one team, would be crowned the undisputed champion of the world. When the news reached Maranello, it was received not with excitement, but with a deep and profound sense of purpose. For Enzo Ferrari, this was the moment he had been working towards his entire life. This was the ultimate validation of motorsport as a serious, global endeavor. It was a stage far grander than he had ever imagined. He gathered his engineers and designers. By now, his team had grown, and the workshop was a hive of focused activity. He explained the challenge ahead. They were a small company, a tiny independent constructor compared to the industrial giants of the automotive world. To compete for a world championship would require a level of commitment and resources that would stretch them to their absolute limit. But there was never any doubt about the decision. This was the very reason the Scuderia existed. To compete at the highest level, to be measured against the very best in the world. A new sense of focus settled over the factory. The work was no longer about winning a single race, but about preparing for a grueling, season-long campaign. New cars were designed, following the complex new formula of rules that gave the sport its name. The engines were refined, squeezed for every last measure of power and reliability. Enzo, however, made a curious decision for the very first race of this new world championship, held at a place called Silverstone in England. He chose not to go. His reasons were a mix of financial concerns and a subtle, prideful protest over the starting money being offered. He would not enter this new era on anyone's terms but his own. He would let the others have their opening day. His story, he decided, would begin at the second race in Monaco. And so, as the first ever World Championship race began without a single red car from Maranello on the grid, Enzo and his team remained in their workshop. They were not watching the celebrations in England. They were working. They were perfecting the machines that they believed would not just compete in this new championship, but would one day come to define it. The dawn of a new age had arrived, and Ferrari was preparing to meet it on its own terms. After skipping the first World Championship race, the Scuderia Ferrari made its debut at the second round, on the glamorous and treacherous streets of Monaco. The little red cars, now more refined and powerful, were a beautiful sight against the glittering backdrop of the harbor. But as they lined up on the grid, they faced a formidable and deeply personal rival. The dominant team of the era, the undisputed kings of Grand Prix racing, was Alfa Romeo. Their cars, the legendary Alfettas, were masterpieces of pre-war engineering that had been refined to perfection. And their drivers were the best in the world, men like Juan Manuel Fangio and Giuseppe Farina. For Enzo, seeing the red of Alfa Romeo was like looking at a ghost. It was the company that had given him his start, the team he had once managed, and the corporation that had tried to silence him. He held a deep, complicated respect for them. He had helped build their legacy in the 1930s, and he knew the brilliance of their engineers better than anyone. Beating any other team would be a victory, but to beat Alfa Romeo, for Enzo, would be a reckoning. It was the only way to truly prove that his path, the path of the independent creator, had been the correct one. The first season of the World Championship in 1950 was a story of Ferrari's challenge and Alfa Romeo's dominance. The Alfas were powerful and reliable, and they won every race they entered. The Ferrari team, with their talented driver Alberto Ascari, fought bravely. They would chase, they would challenge, they would even lead for a few laps, but the final victory remained just out of reach. They would finish second or third, but always, in the end, they would see an Alfa Romeo take the checkered flag. For Enzo, each of these defeats was a sharp, personal sting, but they were also lessons. After each race, the team would return to Maranello, and the work would begin again with a quiet, fierce intensity. The engines were made more powerful, the chassis was made stronger. They were closing the gap. The struggle continued into the next season, 1951. The Ferrari cars were now faster, more nimble than the aging but still mighty Alfettas. The rivalry was no longer a chase. It was a battle of equals. At the French Grand Prix, the Ferrari of José Froilán González fought wheel-to-wheel with the Alfa of Fangio in one of the greatest duels the sport had ever seen. The lead was exchanged time and time again. Then came the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. It was the very same track that Enzo had chosen to skip a year earlier. This time he was there, and this time his car was ready. On that day, the Ferrari finally broke through. González drove a masterful race, and he crossed the finish line ahead of the Alfas. The ghost had been faced. The master had been defeated. When the news of the victory reached Enzo back in Italy, he did not celebrate with shouts of joy. His reaction was far more complex. He was, of course, happy for his team, for his driver, for his name. But he also felt a deep and profound sense of sorrow. He later described his feelings that day with a famous and poignant phrase. He said, "I feel as though I have killed my mother." It was a cry of triumph, but also of love and of loss. He had finally proven his point. He had surpassed the company that had made him, and now he stood alone, the new king, on a throne that was finally and completely his own. The victory at Silverstone in 1951 was a turning point. It broke Alfa Romeo's spell of invincibility and announced to the world that Ferrari had truly arrived. At the end of that season, facing rising costs and having been beaten by their former student, Alfa Romeo made a momentous decision. They withdrew from the World Championship. The great giant of the sport had stepped aside, leaving the path clear for the new force from Maranello. With their main rival gone, the stage was set for Ferrari to dominate. And the man who would carry the Prancing Horse to its first ultimate triumph was Alberto Ascari. Ascari was not just another driver for Enzo. Their connection was deep and personal. Alberto's father, Antonio Ascari, had been a star driver for Alfa Romeo back in the 1920s. He had been Enzo's teammate, his mentor, and his dear friend. Enzo had watched Antonio race, had admired his incredible talent, and had been devastated by his tragic death in a racing accident. When Antonio's young son, Alberto, grew up and showed a talent for driving, Enzo took him under his wing. He saw in Alberto the same natural, fluid skill that his father had possessed. Their relationship was more like that of an uncle and a nephew, or even a father and son. Enzo, who had lost his own brother and father at a young age, felt a deep, paternal protectiveness towards Alberto. In 1952, the Formula One World Championship was run with smaller, less powerful Formula 2 cars, a change that perfectly suited the nimble and powerful machines that Ferrari was building. The season became a showcase for the genius of both the car and its driver. Alberto Ascari and the Ferrari 500 were a perfect union of man and machine. What followed was one of the most dominant periods in the history of the sport. Ascari won every single race he competed in that year. His driving was a form of art. He was incredibly smooth, precise, and deceptively fast. He didn't look like he was wrestling with the car. He looked like he was dancing with it. His style was so fluid that his rivals would watch him, mystified, wondering how he could be so quick while appearing to expend so little effort. He would often build a commanding lead and then simply manage the gap to his opponents with an intelligent, calm control. For Enzo, watching Ascari drive was a source of immense pride. It was a validation not just of his car, but of his faith in the young man who was carrying on his father's legacy. At the end of the 1952 season, Alberto Ascari was crowned world champion. He was the first driver to ever win the title for Scuderia Ferrari. The celebration in Maranello was one of quiet, profound satisfaction. Enzo had done it. He had built a team from nothing, defeated his old masters, and now he had conquered the world. The Prancing Horse was on top of the motorsport mountain, and the man who had taken it there was the son of his lost friend, a connection that made the victory feel not just like a professional triumph, but a deeply personal fulfillment of a long and unspoken promise. The victories on the racetrack brought immense fame and prestige to the Ferrari name. The Prancing Horse was becoming a global symbol of performance, speed, and Italian excellence. But fame does not pay for crankshafts, and prestige does not buy tires. Enzo Ferrari was now facing a new and unfamiliar challenge, one that had nothing to do with lap times or engine power. He was facing the relentless, ever-growing cost of running a world championship-winning racing team. His philosophy was simple and unwavering. The Scuderia, the racing team, was the heart and soul of his company. It was the entire reason for its existence. Everything else was secondary, but that heart required a constant flow of money to keep beating. Designing new engines, hiring the best drivers, transporting cars all over Europe. It was an incredibly expensive enterprise. He had no massive corporation behind him like Fiat or Alfa Romeo. He had no government funding like the German teams had enjoyed before the war. He was an independent, and he had to find his own way to finance his passion. The answer was sitting right there in his workshop, in the beautiful, powerful machines he was creating. Wealthy enthusiasts, aristocrats, and sportsmen from all over the world were beginning to notice the stunning cars that were winning on Sunday. They began to approach him, asking if it was possible to purchase a Ferrari, not for racing, but for the simple pleasure of driving it on the open road. Initially, Enzo was dismissive of the idea. He was a man of the track. He saw no purpose in building a car that would simply be driven to the opera or along a scenic coastal road. He called these potential customers road drivers, and there was a hint of disdain in his voice when he said it. For him, a car was a weapon for competition, not a toy for the rich. But his accountants and his advisors were persistent. They showed him the numbers. They explained that for every racing car he built, he could build several road-going versions. These cars could be sold for a very high price, and the profits could be funneled directly back into the one thing he truly cared about, the Scuderia. Slowly, reluctantly, he agreed. He laid down a set of strict principles. The road cars would not be a separate, lesser breed. They would be direct descendants of the racing cars. They would use similar V12 engines, similar chassis designs, and they would be built with the same uncompromising commitment to performance. He was not interested in building soft, comfortable luxury cars. He was building sports cars, machines that just happened to have license plates. He began to collaborate with Italy's finest coach builders, firms like Pininfarina and Touring. They would take his raw, powerful chassis and clothe them in some of the most beautiful automotive designs the world has ever seen. The Ferrari road car was born not from a desire to enter the passenger car market, but from a pragmatic and almost cynical need to fund a racing habit. Enzo himself remained famously detached from this side of his business. He rarely drove the road cars himself. He was often blunt and even rude to his wealthy clients. But he understood the bargain he had made. Every time a gleaming new Ferrari Berlinetta or Cabriolet was sold to a wealthy industrialist or a Hollywood star, Enzo didn't see a car. He saw a new set of pistons for Ascari's engine, a new gearbox for the next race at Monza, another year of life for his beloved Scuderia. The horse for the road existed for one reason only: to ensure that the horse on the track could always run free. The 1950s were a golden era for Scuderia Ferrari. The team was winning races, and Alberto Ascari had secured a second consecutive world championship in 1953. The beautiful road cars were selling to the wealthy and famous, providing the vital funds to fuel Enzo's racing ambitions. From the outside, the factory in Maranello seemed like a place where dreams were made of steel and painted in brilliant Italian red. But there was a darker, more somber side to this golden age. Motorsport in the 1950s was a terribly dangerous pursuit. The speeds were increasing dramatically, but safety was an afterthought. The tracks were often just public roads, lined with trees, stone walls, and unprotected crowds. The cars themselves had no seat belts, no roll cages, no fire extinguishers. The drivers were men of immense bravery, but they were also incredibly vulnerable. Enzo lived with this terrible reality every single day. He saw his drivers not as employees, but as his champions, his knights. He had a deep, almost paternal affection for them, but his manner was often tough and demanding. He would push them, challenge them, and play them off against each other, always searching for that extra ounce of speed, that extra measure of commitment. He believed that the pressure was necessary to forge a winning spirit. But this pressure, combined with the inherent dangers of the sport, came at a dreadful cost. The first blow to this new era of success came with Alberto Ascari. After winning his 2 championships with Ferrari, Ascari had moved to a new team, Lancia. In 1955, while testing a Ferrari sports car at Monza as a favor to a friend, he crashed. The accident was inexplicable, on a corner that should have been simple for a driver of his skill. He was gone. For Enzo, the loss of Ascari was a devastating personal blow. It was the echo of losing his friend, Alberto's father, Antonio, 3 decades earlier. It was a wound that cut deeper than any lost race. The tragedies continued. The late 1950s were a particularly dark period. One of his most promising young drivers, Eugenio Castellotti, was lost during a private test session at the Medina circuit. Another, Luigi Musso, died in the French Grand Prix. And then, in a single, terrible accident at the German Grand Prix, another of his great drivers, the Englishman Peter Collins, was also killed. Each loss was a heavy weight on Enzo's soul. He was a man who rarely showed his emotions in public, hiding behind a stern expression and a pair of dark sunglasses. But those who knew him well saw the toll it was taking. He would retreat further into himself, becoming more isolated, more demanding. He began to be called cold, ruthless, a man who treated his drivers as disposable parts in his quest for victory. The press, particularly the Vatican's own newspaper, began to criticize him, comparing his ambition to a pagan god that demanded human sacrifice. But this was a cruel and simplistic caricature. In truth, he was a man trapped by his own passion. He had created this world of speed and beauty, and he could not, or would not, stop it. The victories were essential to him, the only validation that made the struggle worthwhile. But the price was becoming almost unbearable. He would attend the funerals, standing stoically in the background. And then, he would return to Maranello, close the door to his office, and face the quiet torment of his own creation. The glory of the Prancing Horse was being paid for, time and time again, with a currency of grief. Amidst the triumphs on the racetrack and the tragedies that so often followed, there was another, more private story unfolding for Enzo Ferrari. It was a story centered on his son, Alfredo, who everyone simply called Dino. Dino was born in 1932, and from his earliest days, he was the undisputed center of Enzo's world. While Enzo could be a difficult and demanding leader to his drivers and his staff, with Dino, he was a doting and loving father. He saw in his son the future of everything he was building. He was not just raising a son, he was mentoring his successor. Dino was not a physically strong boy. He suffered from a debilitating illness, a form of muscular dystrophy, that made him frail. He could never be a racing driver, but he possessed a brilliant and curious mind. He inherited his father's deep love for the automobile, but his passion was for the engineering, the intricate dance of mechanical parts. He studied engineering in Switzerland and returned to Maranello, not as an heir waiting to take over, but as a bright young engineer eager to contribute. He would sit in on meetings with Enzo and the senior engineers, men like Vittorio Jano, one of the most legendary engine designers of all time. Despite his youth and his failing health, Dino's insights were sharp and his ideas were innovative. He became fascinated with the idea of building a new, smaller engine for a new line of Ferrari racing cars. He was convinced that a V6 engine, rather than the traditional V12, could be a lighter and more efficient path to victory in the smaller classes of racing. Enzo, who was a staunch and almost religious believer in the supremacy of the V12, listened to his son. He saw the passion and the logic in Dino's arguments. He encouraged the project, and a powerful bond formed between the aging father, the legendary old engineer Jano, and the brilliant, fragile son. The three of them would work for hours, sketching designs, discussing theories, and laying the groundwork for this new engine. But Dino's health was fading. His body was failing him, but his mind remained as sharp as ever. As he grew weaker and became confined to his bed, the work did not stop. Enzo would spend a part of every single day at his son's bedside. He would bring the engineers and the blueprints with him, and the meetings would continue in Dino's room. The development of the V6 engine became Dino's reason to keep fighting, and it became Enzo's desperate attempt to keep his son engaged and alive. In the early summer of 1956, the battle was lost. Dino passed away at the age of just 24. The loss shattered Enzo Ferrari. The formidable, unshakable leader was broken by a grief that would never leave him. The light in his world had been extinguished. For a time, it seemed as though he might give up entirely. But he found a way to go on, by dedicating his work to his son's memory. He made sure that the V6 engine that Dino had championed was completed. When the new racing car powered by that engine was ready, it was not called a Ferrari. Enzo gave it a new name. He called it, simply, Dino. From that day forward, Enzo Ferrari's public image became even more severe. He wore his dark sunglasses almost constantly, like a shield to hide his grief-stricken eyes from the world. And every morning, for the rest of his life, his first trip of the day would be to the cemetery, to the family chapel, where he would start his day with his son. The roaring engines and the cheering crowds were now just the noise that surrounded a deep, unbreakable, and unending silence. The dawn of the 1960s brought new challenges. The racing world was changing rapidly. British teams, operating out of small garages, were pioneering revolutionary new ideas. They were building cars that were lighter, more agile, with engines placed behind the driver for better balance. Ferrari, with its powerful front-engine V12S, was a titan of the old way of thinking. For a time, it seemed as though Enzo's stubborn belief in his traditional methods might cause him to be left behind. But the Scuderia adapted. Under the guidance of brilliant engineers like Carlo Chiti, Ferrari developed its own rear-engined car, nicknamed the Shark Nose for its distinctive and aggressive look. In 1961, with the American driver Phil Hill, Ferrari once again conquered the world, winning the World Championship in a season of crushing dominance. But this victory, like so many before it, was stained with tragedy at the final, crucial race. A terrible crash claimed the life of Ferrari's other top driver, Wolfgang von Trips, and a dozen spectators. The championship was won, but the celebration was muted, replaced by a somber and familiar grief. Internally, however, a different kind of storm was brewing. The success of the team had brought immense pressure, and the factory in Maranello was a high-strung, intense environment, all orchestrated by the formidable will of one man, Enzo Ferrari. Enzo's wife, Laura, had always been a powerful and often difficult presence within the company. After the death of their son Dino, her grief manifested as an increased and often disruptive involvement in the factory's affairs. She would question decisions, argue with staff, and her presence created a constant, simmering tension. For years, Enzo had managed to keep a fragile peace. But in late 1961, things came to a head. A dispute arose involving the team's highly successful sales manager, who Laura had come to dislike. She demanded he be fired. This time, the senior staff decided they had had enough. A group of the most important men in the company banded together. This was not a minor protest. It was the heart and soul of the Scuderia. It included Carlo Chiti, the brilliant chief engineer who had designed the championship-winning car. It included Giotto Bizzarini, the head of sports car development. It included the team manager and several other key figures. They drafted a letter to Enzo, giving him an ultimatum. He had to curb his wife's influence in the company. If he did not, they would all leave. They believed they were indispensable. They were the men who had just delivered a world championship. They were confident that Enzo would have no choice but to agree to their terms. They had profoundly misjudged the man they worked for. Enzo Ferrari, a man who had never bent to the will of corporations, governments, or even his own grief, was not about to be given an ultimatum in his own house. He felt their letter was not just a complaint. It was an act of profound disrespect, a mutiny. His response was swift and absolute. He called them into his office, one by one, and he fired every single one of them. In a single afternoon, the Scuderia Ferrari was gutted. The chief engineer, the top designers, the team manager, all gone. The press called it the Palace Revolt or the Great Walkout. To Enzo, it was simply the Great Betrayal. He was left standing, almost alone, in the silent workshops that had been, just days before, the home of the world champions. He had his company, he had his name, but he had lost the very team that had made his success possible. To the outside world, it looked like the end of the Ferrari dynasty, an act of self-destruction born from stubborn pride. The winter of 1961 bled into 1962, and it was a period of desperate uncertainty in Maranello. The factory, once the proud home of the world champions, was now a hollowed-out shell. The Great Betrayal had left Enzo with a skeleton crew and a monumental task. A new racing season was just around the corner, and he had no chief engineer, no development team, and a brand new car that was only half designed. His rivals were circling, sensing that the giant from Italy was wounded and vulnerable. The British teams were innovating at a furious pace, and a new threat was emerging from America, where a company called Ford was beginning to pour an ocean of money into its own racing ambitions. It seemed impossible that Ferrari could recover in time. Enzo, isolated but unbending, began the search for a replacement. He did not look for a big, established name. He looked for a man with talent, loyalty, and a hunger to prove himself. He found him in a young, relatively unknown engineer named Mauro Forghieri. Forghieri was just 27 years old. He had been at Ferrari for a couple of years, working in the engine department. He was quiet, brilliant, and deeply passionate about engineering. Enzo had noticed his talent and had been impressed by his work ethic. In a move that shocked the entire company and the racing world, Enzo called the young Forghieri into his office. He did not offer him a promotion. He offered him the entire kingdom. He made him the chief engineer for the entire racing department. He was now responsible for the Formula One team, sports car development, and the technical direction of the entire Scuderia. It was an incredible, almost reckless gamble. Enzo was entrusting the fate of his entire empire to a man younger than most of his own racing drivers. But Forghieri rose to the challenge with a genius that would define the next 2 decades of Ferrari history. He was not just an engine man. He had a deep, intuitive understanding of the entire car, from the chassis to the aerodynamics. He was a tireless worker, often sleeping on a cot in his office, driven by the immense faith his commander had placed in him. He quickly took charge of the half-finished projects left behind by the departed engineers. He finished the design of the new Formula One car and began to develop one of the most beautiful and successful sports cars of all time, the 250 GTO. That year, 1962, should have been a disaster for Ferrari. Instead, it was a triumph of resilience. While the Formula One team struggled to regain its championship form, the sports car division, under Forghieri's guidance, dominated. The new 250 GTO began a reign of success that would cement its place in history as perhaps the greatest Ferrari ever made. Enzo had faced a mutiny that would have destroyed any other company. But in his stubborn, almost tyrannical self-belief, he had rolled the dice on a young, unknown talent. He had found his unlikely savior. Mauro Forghieri would go on to become one of the greatest engineers in the history of motorsport, a legend in his own right. And his long and loyal career, a partnership of genius between him and the old man, began in the ashes of the Great Betrayal, proving once again that in Maranello, the will of Enzo Ferrari was the only force that truly mattered. While Mauro Forghieri was rebuilding the Scuderia's technical department from the ashes of the Great Betrayal, a new and far larger threat was taking shape across the Atlantic Ocean. This was not a rival born in a small European garage. It was the Ford Motor Company, the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful automobile manufacturer in the world. Henry Ford II, the man in charge of the great American empire, had decided that he wanted to win the most prestigious motor race in the world, the 24 Hours of Le Mans. Winning Le Mans, he believed, would give the Ford brand an aura of high-performance glamour that it desperately lacked. At first, Ford decided on the simplest path to victory: to buy it. In early 1963, they approached Enzo Ferrari with an offer to purchase his entire company. The negotiations were long and complex. Ford sent a huge delegation of lawyers and executives to Medina. For a time, it seemed as though a deal was inevitable. Enzo was getting older, and the financial pressures of competing at the highest level were becoming immense. The deal offered him a secure future for his company and a near-infinite budget for his racing team. The final contract was drawn up. It was a thick, imposing document. Enzo sat at his desk in Maranello, with the American executives waiting, and he began to read. He went through the document, page by page, his pen making small notes in the margins. Then, he came to a single clause. It stipulated that after the sale, Ford would have ultimate control over the budget and the decisions of the racing team. If, for example, the Scuderia wanted to spend a certain amount to enter a race, the final approval would have to come from executives in Ford's headquarters in Dearborn, Michigan. Enzo stopped reading. He looked up at the team of American lawyers. He could not, and would not, ever allow a committee of accountants thousands of miles away to tell him whether or not he could go racing. His racing team was his life, his domain. It was not a department. It was the soul of the company. He took his pen, which was filled with a regal, violet-colored ink, and he wrote a single word, "No," next to the clause. Then, he stood up, and with a few brief, formal words, he ended the meeting. The deal was off. The Ford delegation was stunned. They had spent millions of dollars on the negotiation. They flew back to America empty-handed and deeply embarrassed. When they told Henry Ford II what had happened, his response was simple and direct. He reportedly told his top deputies, "All right, we'll beat him." Suddenly, Enzo Ferrari was no longer just fighting against other racing teams. He was at war with the Ford Motor Company. This was not a battle for a single race or a single championship. It was a clash of cultures, a deeply personal feud between two proud and powerful men. Ford poured a fortune into their new racing program. They hired the best engineers, the best drivers, and built a radical new car called the GT40. Their singular goal was to dethrone Ferrari at Le Mans. The first couple of years, the Ford effort was a failure. Their cars were fast but fragile. Ferrari, with its beautifully crafted and reliable prototypes, continued to win. But Enzo knew that the sheer, overwhelming power of Ford's money and industrial might was a tidal wave that was coming for him. The giant across the ocean had been awoken, and its gaze was fixed firmly on the little workshop in Maranello. The battle with Ford at Le Mans became the defining struggle of the mid-1960s. It was David versus Goliath, the artisan against the industrial machine. In 1966, the tidal wave that Enzo had seen coming finally crashed down. Ford arrived at Le Mans not with a couple of cars, but with an entire army. Their GT40 Mark IIs were thunderous, powerful machines, and they were finally reliable. They crushed Ferrari. The defeat was not just a loss, it was a public humiliation. Ford cars finished first, second, and third in a staged photo finish, a calculated and brutal demonstration of their supremacy. For Enzo, a man who viewed Le Mans as his personal territory, the defeat was a bitter pill to swallow. He fought back. The following year, 1967, Ferrari and his team built one of the most beautiful and potent racing cars ever created, the Ferrari 330 P4. It was a masterpiece of Italian engineering, a rolling sculpture designed for the sole purpose of reclaiming their honor. At the 24 Hours of Daytona, on Ford's home soil, Ferrari returned the favor, finishing first, second, and third. But at Le Mans, Ford's power was still too much. Ferrari fought bravely, but could not reclaim the ultimate prize. The racing world was changing. The vast sums of money being poured into the sport by giants like Ford, and soon by commercial sponsors, were making it harder and harder for an independent like Ferrari to compete on all fronts. Enzo, now approaching 70 years old, realized that to secure the future of his company, he would have to make a compromise he had once refused. But this time, he would do it on his own terms. In 1969, he sold a 50% share of his road car company to the Italian automotive giant, Fiat. The deal was a stroke of genius. It provided the company with a massive infusion of capital and a secure industrial partner. But the most important clause in the contract, the one Enzo would not bend on, was that he, Enzo Ferrari, would retain 100% total and absolute control over the Scuderia. Fiat would handle the business of selling road cars. He would handle the business of racing. This partnership secured the future of Ferrari for decades to come. It allowed the racing team to continue, funded and protected. As the years went on, Enzo Ferrari slowly became a figure of legend. He rarely left Medina or Maranello. He never attended another race after the 1950s. He would watch the races on television in his office, connected to the pit lane by a private telephone line. His hair turned white, but his passion never faded. He continued to rule his small kingdom, his fiefdom, as some called it, with an iron will. He would hire and fire drivers, challenge his engineers, and live and breathe for the results of the next race. He oversaw world championships with Niki Lauda in the 1970s and with Jody Scheckter. He lived to see the dawn of the turbo era, always pushing his team to innovate, to fight, to win. He had started with nothing, a boy mesmerized by the sound of an engine. He had built an empire based on a single, unwavering idea. He had known triumph, and he had known tragedy, often in equal measure. He had outlasted all of his rivals, seen the world of motorsport change beyond recognition, yet he had endured. The small workshop in Maranello had become a global symbol of speed, beauty, and relentless ambition. It was the last great kingdom of the automotive world, and he was its one and only undisputed king.
you.